these fundamental human connections, community connections, and our connections to nature, that we need to reestablish them. Even if we're now living in cities, there is so much that can be done, and there's so much that's being done. And this path of reconnection that I write about in Ancient Futures, later on I translated into local futures. In other words, we need to reestablish living face-to-face connections and relationships.
Today's guest is Helena Norberg-Hodge, a pioneer of the global localization movement and one of the most insightful voices on the future of human and ecological well-being. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures, an international organization dedicated to strengthening local economies and restoring cultural and ecological balance. She's best known for her groundbreaking work in Ladakh, where she witnessed firsthand how globalization transforms traditional societies and how a shift towards local, place-based systems can restore community resilience and joy. She's the author of the classic book Ancient Futures and the producer of the award-winning documentary The Economies of Happiness. For decades, Helena has been one of the clearest and most courageous thinkers connecting economics, culture, and the human spirit, showing us that the path to a livable future begins with relocalizing our lives. Now, before we dive in, if you're new to the initiation, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to the first 9 episodes. They form the foundation of this whole journey. That first season traces the arc of our time, from the breakdown of the old systems to the breakthroughs that point towards humanity's next stage of evolution. It's the core thesis behind everything we explore on the show, and it'll give you the context for today's conversation. Helena Norberg-Hodge, welcome to the initiation. So amazing to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm especially excited to have you here today because a lot of my thinking has been informed by your work. And I would love to kind of get us started for us to be taken back by you by going to sort of the initiation that you've experienced in your youth or earlier life, going to Ladakh, which seems to be a cornerstone or the origin point of a lot of your work, and what you've experienced there, and what sort of, in what ways this experience opened your mind to see the world differently.
Well, it's such a long story, but I went there when I was 30 and I had traveled quite a lot. I'd learned quite a lot of languages, but mainly European. And I had lived also in America, different countries in Europe. And I was asked to go to this part of Tibet called Ladakh that actually belongs politically to India. And I went out thinking I'd be there for 6 weeks. I was going with a film team. I was a linguist by this time. I was 30 years old. And I was supposed to help to make the film by also helping with the sound, but being able to pick up a bit of the language so that they could talk to people. Because this whole area had been sealed off. No one had been allowed to go there. And through the whole modern era. And I thought I'd be there 6 weeks, but I fell head over heels in love with the people and the place. And I came across what I believe now to be such an exceptional situation for a number of reasons. One of them was certainly that they had been spared colonialism and, the sort of violence of slavery and so on. They'd also been spared the Christian missionaries who I now understand they'd been protected by Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism actually embraced an indigenous worldview that was very feminine, very organic, and that really recognized that everything in the cosmos is interdependent and interconnected. And as virtually all indigenous cultures knew, that's what Tibetan Buddhism also formalized in a rather intellectual and in rather interesting way. But I also now, when I look at the situation in Ladakh, even today, it's still quite special. I think it's another factor is that this was a culture that had to adapt, as was Tibet, to very, very scarce resources. And so over thousands of years, adapting to scarcity meant that they developed this way of keeping the population stable. And that was through keeping monks celibate and so on. Many people who've never experienced the culture the way it worked from the inside, they actually think the system is patriarchal. I would say the opposite, actually. And so here was this remarkable example of what can happen if we understand the limits of nature and adapt to that. And the remarkable thing was that these people were more radiantly happy, more vital, more full of energy, more full of humor, more, sort of actively joyful than any people I had ever met. So I ended up staying when the film was finished. And at first I started working on the language, and I start actually writing down the spoken language for the first time and work on a dictionary with a monk there. But very quickly, and then I was going to do a PhD. I even sought out Chomsky, who was interested in applying his theories to this very unusual language. But I end up abandoning that because in the meanwhile, I become passionate about trying to raise awareness, both among the Ladakhis, but also in the outside world, that the modern development path is taking us in the wrong direction. It's a path away from nature and away from community.
Yeah. Your journey reminds me a little bit of this book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet. Do you know that one?
Yes.
By Alexandra Knoll, David Knoll.
David Neal.
David Neal. Exactly. Yeah. It's a fantastic book. Like it just describes the mystery and like the title says, the magic of that land. And it seems like you've experienced that as well. Just the state of wonder and connected to the rhythms of the land that these people still had at the time.
Absolutely. That's, I guess, in terms of my experience and focus, it was less on the monks and the religious side and more on everyday life. I lived in, as it were, average families and ended up, very well convinced I should write about industrial books, because I feel that the experience I had of a culture where children almost never cried, not even babies. And so just a book on childcare, because I feel, anyway, I won't go into all of that, but my sort of observations and experience were more among sort of, as it were, ordinary families.
Okay, wonderful. And what was it about this experience that sort of then crystallized into what became Local Futures or Ancient Futures first, and this larger body of work of yours?
Yeah, well, again, it became Ancient Futures. Part of it was what I was saying, that I became so aware that this joy came from, in a systemic way, from the way that people lived. But if you boil it down, it comes down to these fundamental connections. First of all, between people, much deeper, much more collaborative relationships between people, and a much deeper relationship with everything that lives. And so these connections that were also very importantly linked to having the youngest and the oldest connected as part of daily life. I came to realize that this actually leads naturally to more collaborative relationship, and that when we segregate people into separate age groups, we're doing such huge damage. We're rearing our children and ourselves in monocultures. And then it turns out that one of the most fundamental problems in the rest of our economy is that we're rearing the fundamental basic economy, the living earth. So in fisheries, in forestry, in farming, we are trying to grow things in monoculture, which are directly antithetical to how nature works. So the fundamental principle is diversity. So we cut ourselves off from nature, and it's not so much that we cut ourselves off, we were cut off. And that's, I think, for me, an important part of what I'm trying to teach is that we need to realize that this way that we live today, which is responsible for so many, well, for what we now call the poly crisis, everywhere we look, it feels like breakdown. And from my point of view, what I was trying to raise awareness about was that as we were moved through economic pressures away from nature into cities, promised jobs that were scarce and were delivered to us top down, this created friction and violence between people, and it separated us from nature. And then in the meanwhile, the production for our needs became more and more toxic and, as I say, trying to produce things in monoculture. So there were a lot of lessons from Ladakh, but the basic principles of the Ancient Futures book and film that I wrote was that these fundamental human connections, community connections, and our connections to nature, that we need to reestablish them. Even if we're now living in cities, there's so much that can be done and there's so much that's being done. And this path of reconnection that I write about in Ancient Futures, later on I translated into local futures. In other words, we need to reestablish living face-to-face connections and relationship. And we can do that even from the city, and it's happening. There is a real widespread cultural shift. Wherever people have been pushed into the big city, into the high-rise world, they are in every country that I know of, and I know lots of them. Our materials were translated into almost 50 languages. So what we see is this pattern where this high-rise, high-density urban existence just doesn't work for us. So you literally see depression rising and even suicide rising, ill health rising with that type of life. And so you see people coming back, and sometimes they may still live in the city, but they're reestablishing their connections through local food and through vision quests and connection to wilderness, not necessarily as part of daily life, but it's absolutely, when you look close to the ground, you will find that these trends are emerging everywhere. And broadly, I call that localization.
Yeah. And this has now transformed over the years into your organization, Local Futures, as you mentioned. And if you had to describe sort of the core tenets or practices that you promote at Local Futures, what would you name?
Well, I mean, we are, broadly speaking, we're promoting localization. And we do that by urging people to change the I to a we. So we like to encourage people to think about 5 words. And the first one is reconnect. The second one is rethink. And the third one is resist, renew, and rejoice. Now, these words, the first one, reconnect, is both reconnect to other people. So again, that's probably in Local Futures, we are today rather unique because so many of my indigenous friends and so many people are waking up to this profound disconnection from nature. But probably even more important for our well-being, the disconnection from one another is something that became so obvious to me in Ladakh, seeing both, as it were, the before and the after. So reconnecting to others, what does that mean? Well, I became very interested in AA, even though I've never studied it closely. But every time I've checked with people who had anything to do with it, I see that the fundamental part of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which now is also a process which has had severe drug addiction, violence, sex addiction, eating disorder. And the fundamental building block is that you do it in community. Yeah. So here people are helped to see that they're not alone. So they don't have to carry this baggage of believing that they're the only ones that are this bad. It's incredibly important that we reconnect at that deeper level. That is also a process which is re-emerging through the urbanizing, industrializing, globalizing part. As people feel more and more lonely, we see everywhere things like women's circles, men's circles, father and son circles, mother and daughter circles. We see the reweaving of deeper conversations and sharing. And key is being able to be vulnerable, being able to be imperfect, because we were pushed into this separation, which was fundamentally about competition. And we were essentially led to believe that unless we're perfect, we're not going to be loved. So that even inside marriages, people have hesitated to really share from a deeper, more vulnerable position. So now, so this is a way in which our work in Local Futures is addressing a deep psychological, spiritual crisis, which we see as linked to a structural global economic crisis. And that's why for us, we encourage people wherever possible to change the I to a we. And that means trying to find a like-minded person, or 2 or 3 or up to 20, with whom they can sort of take a journey that will be what we're promising people is that there is a journey that can actually be healing for you personally, as well as guide you towards action and activism that's going to be more systemic. We can't afford to treat isolated symptoms. I mean, partly we can't afford it, but it's also why the environmental movement has failed so badly. Separate human well-being from environmental well-being. It's been so the journey that we encourage people on is this reconnection with one another. And once we understand the deeper psychological aspects, we also want to reconnect more actively to nature. And in our very busy lives, and by the way, I would say this is one of the main reasons for the polycrisis, is that the system that has been driving us from the land and breaking down community has simultaneously robbed us of time in this exponential way. So we have to be really aware of that, and we have to be creative and strategic to figure out how to deal with that. And one of them is to try to form part of a group so that then one of you can figure out where might we go as a family group, ideally bringing children and the older people, and spend time in nature that's as wild as possible. May not be super wild, but still away from the noise of the mechanical consumer culture. So there too, encouraging children to approach the environment, the wild or the nature around them in a more contemplative way, in a in a way where they're encouraged to see if they can feel part of the trees and the sky instead of maybe just playing football, which can also be good. But anyway, so this reconnection is a very important part of what then very soon we also encourage people to be willing together to rethink assumptions which we see are ideas in which we are locking ourselves into the crisis. Ideas that keep us trapped in the notion that we individually are to blame for everything that's going on. We individually should be recycling that plastic. We individually are going to be using, recycled plastic instead of first time plastic. So we are so locked into narrow assumptions. And so there's quite a lot of rethinking that can liberate us to try to look a little more honestly and from a bigger picture what's going on. So the rethinking, we provide a curriculum and materials. And in part of that is also that we need to be willing to say a clear no to what is wrong and destructive. We need to be willing. We believe in an always peaceful and compassionate way, but still having a clear no to what is. We'll see as we study it is really a sort of corporate and banking empire that has ended up running our worldview, our science, our governments behind the scenes. And so many good people are part of that. They've just been so trained into over specialized thinking. And so anyway, there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done that will then make it clear to us that we need to be able to say no. And then we talk about, resistance as well as renewal. The renewal not only consists of actually trying to take action, but very, very importantly, communicating the information about things that are actually happening already. Because we have no idea about how many initiatives, how many millions of people are still living closer to the earth, are benefiting from more community, and how many new initiatives are being born. Now, almost by definition, small is beautiful. And so most of these things that work really well are community-based, they're small, they're very often initiated by women. And unfortunately, they tend, of course, they're not going to be picked up by media, which is now fundamentally corporate. And so we don't get to hear about them. So a very important part of our work is what we call big picture activism. And that is then, so an action is not just trying to start a project but it's communicating this information, why we need to localize, why we need to rebuild place-based relationships and take a fundamentally different development path, but also to show how much of that's actually happening. And then the final word is rejoice, which is sort of part also of discovering how much is happening. It's very much part also of discovering that we've been lured down a path where we actually don't distinguish between the living world created before us and a man-made world. A man-made world which, yes, has brought certain benefits, but a man-made world which now threatens to destroy life itself. And so we've got to now be much more clear about which path forward we want to support. Are we make a turn towards nature, or are we going to continue away?
Wow, beautiful. Yeah, there's a lot in there. And I'm curious, what would you say in your own understanding is the root cause of this global corporate superstructure that has emerged over the last many decades and the
Well,
polycrisis resulting from
yeah.
that. Like, if you could identify, where do you see the root of it?
Well, I do. I really do see steps over hundreds of years. And I do not agree with the very common assumption, which is that when humanity started farming, everything went downhill. That I see as something pushed by big business. Because that traps us in this idea that, oh, well, as human beings, we only lived relatively sustainably before we started farming. And that traps us in this idea that we all have to become sort of tribal nomads virtually. And on a crowded planet, it's very hard to imagine that. But that's what I have seen, and there's all kinds of evidence. You know, in Asia, there were farms for thousands and thousands of years. In Australia, you know, the Aboriginal communities were farming for 40,000 years. And so what I see as a very important rupture is really what arose out of Europe and became a global economy. So the root to what's been going on in the last, essentially since the late 80s, the roots really go back to the beginnings of the modern what was even then a global economy. And their roots were actually intertwined with Christianity. So Christianity, missionaries, along with traders, spread around the world with the message that you, nature-based cultures, are all inferior, you're primitive, you're nobody. And that was combined with a trade that often lured people in or very soon became an aggressive power, which then in turn pretty quickly became colonialism, slavery, colonialism, and in Europe, enclosures. So pushing people off the land in Europe was very much part of the same process where elites that were interlinked globally, essentially pushed people away from a more diversified, self-reliant economy. That, in turn, was then turned into the principle of comparative advantage in the modern economy, where it was formally specified. Don't produce a range of things for your needs. No, you specialize for export. Specialize in what you're good at. On the surface, that sounds fine. You know, in Scotland, you can grow oats well, just grow lots of oats and export. But in the meanwhile, already then, in the 1700s, this had led to this huge gap between rich and poor. You know, as people were pushed off the land, everything broken down, huge gap between rich and poor, just a mess. And unfortunately, what we've been trained to believe is that was the beginning. We were impoverished, we died much younger, and then progress came along. We haven't been allowed to study what was there when, as we did in most of our evolution, in order to live more directly off the real economy, the living earth, the water, the soil, the earthworm. In order to do that well, we needed one another. So we evolved in groups of often hundreds and intergenerational. So we evolved in those groups, and we had plenty of help for everything we did. I mean, this is, again, what I saw very closely in Ladakh, but what I've studied after that they work so much less than we do. And, you know, even when they were building a big monument or monastery or something, had huge boulders standing in a row right next to each other and holding that boulder for 1 second and passing it along while singing. It was fun. It was really fun. And, anyway, so I don't want to romanticize that pre-industrial, community-based way of life, but I would say that it would be more than possible in a way for us to have our cake and eat it too, if we would understand that we need to do away with being ruled by global traders. But this step-by-step development, another step was after the Second World War, when, probably persuaded by big banks and corporations, governments were sitting around the table after the Second World War at Bretton Woods, and they set up the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the idea was that in order to avoid another war, another depression, we need to be integrated. And the idea was that everything was integrated, essentially by giving the red carpet to giant global corporations. So then, when we had a bit of a crisis in the economy again, the corporations started pushing harder in the 80s to get these new trade treaties. And this is a new push, when really it should have ended by then. And then, well, I guess another one, actually 2008, when people realized that people trading in our mortgages, trading with documents of people who had no idea who they were, where they were, and they were ruining the lives of millions of people. It was clear that we needed regulation in the financial sector, but instead we were told, no, too big to fail. So now we're at a point where maybe I feel even in the corporate world, there are so many people who have no idea of the way that the giant global corporations that have pushed monocultures that require chemicals, that require glyphosate. Now they're doing that with regenerative agriculture. And there are conscious efforts there to destroy smaller, local, because that's now built into the economy, is that the giants are amazingly vigilant at destroying small competitors. You would think, why would they bother? But we've studied this, and if anyone is interested, they should look at our book called Small is Beautiful, Big is Subsidized. So what's happened is that governments on left and right really not understanding what they're doing. They've been using subsidies, taxes, and regulations to favor global businesses. And they think, Sweden thinks, we've got to have trade negotiations in secrecy because Volvo will have trade secrets, in competition with Fiat or Ford or whatever. And it is so naive and it's so blind, but it's because almost no one has been studying that global economic system. And we have done that. And I helped to start a group called the IFG, the International Forum on Globalization, in 92. I organized the first meeting for that. Yeah, we did have a bit of an impact, and then it sort of died down. I think now again with the crisis, hopefully there will be more discussion, more interest in basically understanding the global economy, and therefore understanding why it's in everybody's interest to support a shift towards the local.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier we could have our cake and eat it too. And I'm curious what that actually means because, in some ways the genie is out of the bottle in terms of all the amenities we have, the technologies that we have. How do you see that localized future where we are more community-based, we are receiving a significant portion of our produce and other products more locally? Does that there must be trade-offs. Like, where are the trade-offs? Because it sounds too good to be true that we could have our cake and eat it too.
I know. And my husband always tells me, I sound so naive when I say this. It'd be so easy. Honestly, my experience is that we are in this mess because almost no one has looked at how the system works internationally. And so what I've found is that almost all the people who've been studying internationally in economics, in law, whatever, it's all been locked into the assumption that this path, which essentially has been a path to support the big and destroy the small. And remember again, where you see it most clearly how destructive it is. It's in farming. Fishery and farming, now fishery, the trawling boats have nets that can hold 17 jumbo jets. They're just sweeping all life off the seabed and destroying it. Small fishing boats adapted, and even when they get a fish, that is too small, they put it back. I mean, it's just like, and then in farming, it again, and in forestry, I mean, in Germany, actually, you're from Bavaria, a friend of mine was the head of the ecological forestry group in Germany. And when we had very, very severe winds, I think it was in the early 80s, they found in Germany that, again, of course, the trees that had been bunged up in monoculture were useless. And that, proper trees do not grow in some, artificial monoculture. And so but in farming, even more, it's virtually impossible to grow in a really healthy way when you've got, thousands of acres just doing one thing. The minute you start diversifying, you're reducing your risk, not one hailstorm, not one blight of this fungus or this bug is going to destroy everything. But in fact, small diversified farms can produce far more per unit of land and water. Far, far more. They're more productive. And to be really efficient and good, they need to employ more people. So on this crowded planet, where we could have our cake and eat it too, is if we would, immediately turn away from policies that now literally around the world virtually are systematically replacing people by using more energy, more minerals, more water, more of nature of every kind, chewing up, poisoning more nature to destroy jobs. On a crowded planet where that means shoving people also away from the land, because that's built into this. We don't want the self-reliance. So pushing people off the land. And in many parts of the world, you still have 30-40% of people on the land close to farming being pushed off into cities, promised jobs that don't exist. And that's leading to immigration. And immigration is now linked to a rise in fascism. So we are creating, the most hideous prejudice, divisiveness of every kind. And even within the native country, when people are driven off the land to compete for jobs, it leads to violent conflict, as I wrote about in Ancient Futures. And I saw it closely in both Ladakh and Bhutan. So I think if we understood how much damage has been inflicted, how much illness, how much mental illness, how much, of course, toxic pollution of land. Every day, we know we're extinguishing species of plants and animals. So I'm saying, held up against that, the reality of the world today, so suffering, so much sicker, species being lost, languages being lost, whole cultures down. So if you look at the reality of that, what I'm saying is, with a relatively small shift in policy, starting to support instead more people involved in virtually everything we care about. So if we care about the health of the ecosystems, of the plants and the water and the life that we depend on, more people can nurture and are nurturing things back to life. And I'm seeing it. Seeing it as amazing win-win-win, which does feel like having your cake and eating it too. And it's happening on a small scale. So because I know so many small-scale examples where literally in 5 years, barren land that was dead, basically, flourishing with diversity. And when it's combined with people engaged in that process, so the community building and the connection to nature in that practical way is restoring mental health, physical health, ecological health. And generally, it can even be financially viable. But the financial system that's part of this global system makes these examples very rare in the sense that we're still talking about relatively small percentages. But when I see it happening all around the world, and when I see how effective it is, I maintain my hope and my faith in human nature and in that instinct that makes people not want to live in that high-rise competitive consumer culture. And when I see how many initiatives are being taken and how much health they restore, it's incredible. And it is, having our cake and eating it too. It means we could literally move towards healing the planet, healing ourselves, while we reduce the gap between rich and poor, while we also allow people to be more creative. So when I say that we can actually have our cake and eat it too, I'm talking about the fact that with just a few shifts in policy, and what we're talking about is instead of subsidizing and supporting and deregulating for the use of more of nature, more energy, more water, more resources, and employing fewer people. If we move in the opposite direction, we are demonstrating in the localization movement that we can actually, in a relatively short period, heal people, physical health, mental health, and ecological health. And that the restoration in so many projects I know is so rapid. It's so inspiring. So at the same time that we would be healing people and the environment, if we shift the economy to allow this to become the norm, if that's what we now support in the economy, then we're also talking about very rapidly reducing the gap between rich and poor. We're talking about allowing people to become much more creative. The creativity comes from being closer to the real economy. So instead of far removed so that everything becomes a number, you are now engaged with the actual living people or living plants or living trees on which you depend. And that means that every single day is different. We don't realize how deadening it is to have been separated from the realities to reduce everything to a number. And I think most people will know what I'm talking about if they think about what's happened, for instance, in healthcare. About how many years ago is it in several countries? Probably 20, maybe it's 30 years ago. The doctor might actually even come to your house. Now, year by year, the amount of time the doctor will spend with you when you go to see him or her has shrunk shorter. And ever since computers and the internet have become endemic in our way of life, they're spending more and more time looking at the computer instead of looking at you when you go to see them. It's now been reduced down to about 5 minutes, but we're also reaching these crisis proportions where, for instance, the NHS now in England, middle-class people with serious ailments can't even get an appointment. So we are so clearly supporting a system that's broken. But right now, far too many people believe that AI is what's going to solve this, when AI is actually going to be building on this concentration, top-down, and very frighteningly using so much water, so many minerals, leading to so much mining. So we stand now at this crossroads. Do we go towards more dependence on technology? And we're talking about a a really sort of geometric leap? Or are we going to move in the direction of nature? And I want to urge people to understand that this is not about whether you and I use AI. Let's use it. Already now I've asked questions of ChatGPT. It's not about you and me using it. This is about a techno-economic, mega technological system being used by a mega system that is responsible for the poly crisis. And this technology in the hands of that system is going to make it vastly, vastly worse. More speedy, more exploitative, more destabilizing of everything that lived. Now, in the meanwhile, we could use AI to communicate about this, to try to mobilize more people towards the local, towards the natural, warning about AI being used in this system, trying to bring in collaboration, and especially bring out the big picture so more people can connect the dots and see why the last thing we need now is a technology that uses even more of the earth to replace even more people. It's unbelievable to me how many of my beloved environmental colleagues are romanticizing somehow that this system could be employed, that AI as a system could be employed to support love, care, deep ecological knowledge, to rebuild the world we really want. We have wonderful brains. We have wonderful hands. We spent thousands of years developing different skills. And if we'd be willing to learn, really learn from indigenous cultures and knowledge and learn from one another, there's so much innovation, there's so much creativity, there's so much technology that could really serve us. But no intelligent person today would ever choose a technology that's going to use more resources and replace more people. We've got 8 billion people. We have already been on a path where day by day we're extinguishing more of nature, literally exterminating species forever. Now, how can we possibly think that we want a technology that's going to continue in this direction?
I with a forgiving view on humanity, I personally, I see, the drive for globalization and the interconnectivity of the world as a a seemingly good thing that also brought a lot of benefits, connected the world in many ways, but in this very monolithic corporate structure. And we've sort of neglected the nuance, the humanity that underlies the superstructure that is us, right? Like our human needs for connection, intimacy, being exposed to the raw living earth. And I want to believe, similar to you, I guess, that there is a path forward that acknowledges the rise of these new ways of being and the incredible technologies that we have now developed. Literally, there's this famous quote by E.O. Wilson: "We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and now godlike technology." And this is the needle that we have to now thread, of acknowledging there are godlike technologies. We can't put them back into the bottle. The genie's out. But we somehow have to find back to our own humanity while, treating them with so much care and sort of integrity and groundedness, so that we do use them for what they are useful for, but we do not forget what is actually more important and more intimate to us, which is our humanity and our human relationship to ourselves and nature. So I personally find that is this middle path that we need to somehow find, because to somehow say, okay, we have to shut the door, we can't use AI at all, or we have to go back to living in local small communities in subsistence farming, is possible for some, but probably not realistic on a larger scale.
Yeah, well, I think, what I think would be entirely possible is that we would see that the thriving in smaller towns and smaller cities is so superior to what you would see in these monstrous cities, which have grown up again as part of a corporate system that has
Can you
been
give some, are there specific examples that you're particularly excited about?
Oh, well, I mean, no, a lot. I mean, I think that anyone, like in Germany, people will know Freiburg is a lot more pleasant to live in than Berlin or Hamburg. But actually, Germany doesn't have quite as many. It's really more in the third world where you see the monstrous growth. You have to look at Mumbai and at Beijing, and look at Beijing. It grew, within about 30 years to 50 million people. Mexico City, but London, New York as well. If you actually look, so there, if you compare even Bristol in the UK to London, Bristol has got about 500,000 people, and it's a very, very pleasant place to live, still connected to the land, both in the city and around the city. We've actually done quite a lot of work there also on local food, and we worked with the mayor of Bristol a couple of years ago. We've actually worked with them more than that, quite over about 10 years or so. And so I think most people, if they had the opportunity to go shopping, for a place to live and to compare the opportunities, that the majority would prefer that more human scale. And yet, for many people, the sort of idea of going back to local now is based on seeing small villages that have been abandoned, that have been trampled on since the very beginning of this economy. The entire process has been removing people and removing power from their creativity. And also this rise of the urban center and people left behind. Even in Ladakh, that's now the situation. Almost no one would want to live in that more decentralized way. So we can't compare it with small and local that's been left behind and disempowered. But we can, again, if we look through our lenses and look at, like I said, Freiburg, for instance, or, many similar examples around the world, Boulder, Colorado, now Berkeley, where we used to have an office in California, because I taught at the University of Berkeley. And so really our organization was started there, and we had an office there for 40 years. But Berkeley has sort of been destroyed by Silicon Valley and what's happened to San Francisco because of that. And, so you have these sprawls where towns merge into one. And all the time, everywhere you look, farmers being destroyed. And that's just not. So making farming enjoyable, making farming important, that's part of our localization movement. And it's happening. It's happening in every country I know of, actually. It's smaller initiatives, but on the other hand, Via Campesina is the biggest social movement in the world, with about 200 million farmers. And still, it's up against this corporate empire that doesn't want farming, wants AI run indoor, high-rise. So when you say, we can't put it back, nuclear power, thank goodness, in many countries was rejected. So the idea that certain technologies can't be rejected I don't agree with. And I would say that's true with genetic engineering as well. And the
But I mean,
continued,
nuclear power is on the rise again, especially now,
sorry?
and it has never left. I mean, France is almost entirely dependent on nuclear power. Many other countries as well. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it hasn't been abandoned. No, but the idea that it can't be, I don't subscribe to that. But I think with something like AI, like I said, right now, lots of people are using it
yeah,
for, to help them.
yeah,
Overall, when you look at what it will mean
yeah,
for many jobs, it's quite worrying already. But certainly something like AI could be used to avoid climate emergencies and to
yeah,
have shared information when it's really needed rapidly, for emergencies. But to distinguish between its use in that way, which is exactly the opposite of what it's being used now for a financial casino, where
yeah,
algorithms are already every day looking at the cracks, and we're talking about breakdown. That's what's lucrative.
yeah,
Literally war. I mean,
yeah,
there's war at every level.
yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure if you're aware of the work of Tristan Harris. He
Yes.
was the founder of the social network and now has the Institute of Human Technology, and
Yeah.
is very much focused on this race dynamic towards artificial superintelligence.
Yeah.
And one of the examples he's been using for this idea of global coordination to avoid a global catastrophe was in the 1980s the Montreal Protocol around the ozone layer, where
Yeah.
specific gases were identified to sort of harm the ozone layer, and
Yeah.
lo and behold, pretty much all countries, and especially the US, came
Yeah.
together to ban these specific gases, which then restored the ozone layer. So, which is one of the bigger positive
Yeah.
projects or initiatives in
Yeah.
environmentalism over the last decades,
Yeah.
and he just names that as a coordination effort on a global scale that was
Yeah.
successful, because a lot of people just say, oh, we are trapped in this game theoretic dynamic now towards
Yeah.
superintelligence. And you see this obviously in many other domains as well. But I find that an interesting example to just point to instances where we have actually managed to turn the corner. Um,
Yeah.
I just wonder, and this sort of idea of turning the corner, like with everything that you say, and at the same time also acknowledging all the pretty intense race dynamics and vectors across not just technology but the economy, climate, you could say geopolitics, etc. Do you feel we have a chance to turn the corner, like on a global scale, to avert a bigger catastrophe of some sort?
I think what surprised me was that in England, friends who had been completely uninterested in the environmental movement suddenly said enough is enough, and they joined Extinction Rebellion, and they went out and lay in front of cars. And for me, that was misguided. I wasn't at all promoting that kind of thing, because I've always been trying to say we cannot separate the environmental from the human. And there are too many people just struggling to pay the rent, and all it's doing is leading to anti-green sentiment. But I'm trying to say is these were people I was really surprised that they were quite well off or even wealthy or middle class, suddenly going out, So I think it's possible that there could be a wake up where people say enough is enough. But I'm hoping the target is going to be the system, and it doesn't need violence. So I could imagine that 2, 3 years from now, there would have been enough awareness that actually our governments are not running the show. This whole left-right has clearly broken down. And let's really try to understand why, which is partly what we're trying to share, and to get people to look at this global system, which almost no one is. Tristan Harris hasn't either. And what's his name? Schmachtenberger hasn't either. I'm really hoping to talk to both of them, because there are very, very few people who actually studied this global system. And so therefore, like just the other day, I can't believe how, we did a little film on trade, and we thought it'd be so clear that this is what we need to focus on. That people don't get it until you spell out that these trade treaties where governments are signing in black and white, we will not do anything that threatens your profit. You can take us to court. That our governments are being taken to court by private global corporations, and that we don't even get to hear about it, but that we don't understand. That means we are run by a blind machine that we simply have to, first of all, slow down and then break up. There's absolutely, so now I could imagine that there could be a sort of wake up, and then that people from left and right and whatever race, indigenous, whatever, male, female, all of these politics of identity falling away, to say, we are no longer going to comply with a system where much less than 1% of humanity is running the show. Much, much less than 1%. We are no longer going to comply with that. We are going to need more visible, accountable systems. Now, what will that mean to AI? It would mean that there would be civic society, democratic processes to determine where it makes sense and where it doesn't. And it does not make sense as a servant to an interlinked system that is about this financial extraction and pushing consumerism on babies virtually before they're born. And then telling us that we're to blame for this, creating this deep, pessimism and self-rejection, because the system has managed. And I even know one of the architects of this was Maurice Strong. And, I was just hearing now. Anyway, he is an architect of building up the corporate lobby for framing the environment. He wasn't doing it out of ill will, but he was a self-made multimillionaire who became concerned about the environment. And then he and Al Gore take off from there. Al Gore, too, totally wedded to, free trade, genetic engineering, the information society. And then they, fund the Rio meeting. And also, actually, I was in Johannesburg was it Rio plus 20? I can't remember. But anyway, it was so depressing in Johannesburg. Like the center of this supposed giant environmental meeting were these new cars, these new, whatever, were they even electric at that time? I can't remember, but it's just totally taken over. And all the climate negotiations dominated by big business. Yeah. And so I do think that anywhere you would go in the world today, people would feel that global corporations have too much power, and they would prefer to see that change. But right now, from my point of view, they haven't really had any information about how they got so much power and how both left and right have supported it actively, and how therefore left and right politics has become meaningless. And in fact, now the left is doing everything to just push more people into a very dangerous right wing, what we can call fascism. So I think, I think it's possible we could have a big wake up and a big movement, and that people would be thrilled to know that this systemic problem has a systemic solution, and so that shrinking of the economy to be subservient to democracy is something that is entirely doable. Doable in the sense, practically doable, as long as it has the will of the majority. If you do know David Corton, he says in our film, The Economics of Happiness. Have you seen The Economics of Happiness?
I have, yeah.
Okay, good. Because he also is saying that, the only reason they have all that power is because we give it to them. Yeah. And we do so in our ignorance. And I see that among politicians. I see it among the CEOs themselves. And that also gives me hope, because I don't see the main problem as being just blind greed or blind, like this become very fashionable to talk about the CEOs as all being narcissists and so on. I don't see that. However, they're not the first ones who are going to change things. I mean, I'm happy to talk to them when I can, but, and I'm working with a few people in multinational businesses who are wanting to contribute to. But what I'm seeing everywhere, honestly, Sebastian, is that almost no one has studied this system as it really is. So they still, when they talk about globalization, including Trump, they talk about it as relationships between countries. It's not about that. And it hasn't been for hundreds of years. So, yeah.
I mean, in this sort of global awakening, there's so many aspects how we need to break through old layers and unconscious behaviors, and your field of inquiry and your study object of global trade and this monolithic structure is a very important one, no doubt. And yet it's such a cacophony nowadays, especially amplified by social media, that people are exposed to, that I find myself also kind of overwhelmed. Like, let's say you have small children, you want to care about healthy food for them. That in and of itself is already its own rabbit hole and study object. And then education for small kids, and then you're kind of tapped out, because you can't study global trade agreements and the central bank's role in exploiting the global south and all of that. So it's just kind of too much for the individual, I find often.
I'd love to know, because we're thinking of doing a course for people who are interested. And we're very aware, because we used to do courses way back in the 80s and 90s. And then it was paper and people had time. But now everything has to be so shortened. But like I was saying, people could be part of a group and then also do research on how to bring more culture and healing into their lives while looking, because in a way, very quickly, we don't feel we need to study the trade treaties in any depth. There's certain main facts there that we need to know. But then also, if we just look at the examples of the smaller and the local and the benefits, there's such a, it could lead relatively quickly. You see, again, remember, local is something that can appeal to the sort of, if you like, blue collar workers. In other words, we don't want our government to be subsidizing food from the other side of the world. We want them our farmers and our jobs. So a certain right wing mentality can also happily link hands with that. The problem is really the left that has been more trapped into believing that they're being good people if they say, oh yeah, more immigrants, we love them all. They don't realize. And we want them to be willing, which they would be if we can reach them. They are willing when we reach them, to think about, why are their economies being destroyed? What's happened? What is the war there about? And we have a very open and very loving approach that can definitely and does appeal to the left. We don't actually interact that much with these type of right-wing people, but I can definitely see how they could link up.
Now, in terms of very practical advice let's say for me, we live in a small rural village where there's already, we have a local farm, organic farm that we get most of our
Yeah.
produce from. There is a sense of community through local WhatsApp groups. People know each other by name in the streets. They have potluck dinners, etc. But we've been thinking there's for a lot of people in my generation, the dream of living in a real community, in a real intentional community.
Yeah.
But the practicality of actually doing that and then, completely replanting into a new environment and setting a community up from scratch is kind of very hard to pull off, not for everyone. And I wonder if you have some practical advice for, let's say, us, how to infuse a greater sense of community, relocalize certain aspects of our supply chain, of our economy, or like point me to some ideas and maybe resources where it's quite applicable for, like, let's say, us in a local community.
Well, when you say, again, us in a local community, how big is your community?
I would say 800 families or so, 1,000 maybe.
Well, I mean, I certainly would recommend showing our films and then seeing how other people here would like to pursue this further and forming a group. And I find that building on the knowledge about the intergenerational connections, there are initiatives that, see, the problem is so many of them are piecemeal and separate, but like some initiatives in a community of about 1,000 people actually put up a notice and say, there are a lot of young families here, but the grandparents aren't here, and there are a lot of old people who feel lonely. Why don't we gather in the park, next Sunday? I love projects like that, and some of them are quite effective. What's scary is that there have also been voices in some places saying, oh, you have to be careful because of pedophilia.
Yeah.
But, as long as people who take the initiative are aware enough and strong enough and are aware that they do need to keep an eye, but it's not going to prevent them from trying to come together in their community. Because the fear is just, which has also affected Steiner schools in this horrible way, because there had been some sexual thing. We just have to decide we're not going to be acting out of fear. We're going to act out of love, but with discretion, because there's a lot of new age, sort of totally people who are not able to trust their intuition and who are not even in touch enough with other people to keep a bit of an eye. And I also would urge, anyone really, to, when you do set up a group, to do it quite selectively. So we also find what's another very difficult thing is that where I am here in Byron Bay, I don't know if you know about it, but it used to be it was one of the biggest alternative culture areas in the world. So when we first came here in 2000, there were probably about 100 eco-villages in this area where people had bought land together and were giving. But now most of them, over these 25 years, the pressures are breaking them up. So they're changing legally now so that you can set your property independently, which previously they couldn't do. They were owning the land together. But anyway, in the meanwhile, we're supporting, someone in England who's moving ahead right now. We're trying to set up a sort of formula, what do you call it? Like a strategy for people who want to set up sort of eco-villages. He's also building straw bale round houses so they can offer a family, sort of a a 2-child family a house for about £30,000, which is very cheap in today's market, straw bale and that kind of thing. So, but if you look at the Global Eco-Village Network, or if you're looking at that kind of thing, but I think having a community group like that then looks at further initiatives, for sure, it's worth expanding the food economy now. I'm really noticing here, we're beginning to see shortages like we've never seen before. And we're very lucky. Well, I started 4 farmers markets here, and they're actually thriving, thank goodness. They're thriving, but there are still not that many new young farmers coming. Because that shifting the food economy is really the most important thing we can do. If you look, did you see this little film we made? It's only like $500 film that is called Local Food Can Save the World.
I have not, no.
Like in that little film, I didn't even bring in, if you contrast the global food system with local food economies, and again, exactly how local we're talking, exactly how global. Well, how global means from European countries, things regularly going to China to be filleted or peeled and then back again. I mean, and importing and exporting the same product. I mean, none of those emissions included in the climate negotiation, not mentioned anywhere. So the shifting the food economy, and imagine that there are all the storms and things cutting off your community. Now, you're probably lucky in South Africa; it won't be as dramatic as in Europe. But in Europe and in America and Australia, it's pretty extreme. So I would also, you've seen we have a localization action guide on our website.
I think I've seen that. Yeah, that's a good pointer.
Yeah, you could look at that. I'm not sure exactly how good it is. It was done by our team in America. Yeah.
Wonderful. What is something that you would like to sort of leave our listeners with as a hopeful message for the future?
Yeah, I'd like to leave everyone with the knowledge that there is so much more going on around the world than most people realize, that testify to human perseverance and goodwill. And that also testifies to the need for all of us to respect the feminine in men and women. Most of these really wonderful things that are being created, a very large proportion, are started by women. And yet we don't hear so much from them. They're usually not the speakers, but there's a need for all of us to respect the feminine, the caring, the nurturing. And for any of you familiar with left and right brain thinking, it's about the right side of the brain as well, a more holistic and deeper view of life. And that deeper view would include joining us on this journey of trying to learn as much as we can about the incredible things that are happening in the localization movement. So I'd also love to invite people to join us on our World Localization Day, which we launched on June 21st. And then around the world, even if you just have a local food feast with a few friends, where you consciously think about where your food comes from, and also where you link up with people on every continent who really are part of a shift in direction. It's happening. So whatever you think and however bad things are getting, not everything everywhere is going from bad to worse. In quite a few places, but quite the invisible, they're going in the opposite direction, in the right direction, towards health and happiness and collaboration.
Wonderful. That's a great way to close this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Helena.